Hello world, welcome to CSL TV. I'm your host Sean Slattery, and in this episode we're going to build ourselves a virtual network, specifically with a domain controller that we're going to use as the basis for our future lab environment tests, policy changes, hardening, and all that. So let's get started. So in order to build a virtual lab environment, first thing we're going to need is virtualization software. Now, if you don't already have a license for the likes of VMware Workstation, or if you don't have a Windows license capable or license for Hyper-V, then you can use what we actually prefer using ourselves, which is VirtualBox. It is a free open source application. You can access it from virtualbox.org. As of April 22nd, give or take, 7.0.8 is the latest version. One note on that, we actually don't like the latest 7 build. It has a flashy UI, but we find that the fancy graphical interface actually detracts from the core need, which is just virtualization. So we actually like using 6.1, the older build, which is still supported at the moment through the end of the year. So to access that, just go to virtualbox.org, click downloads. If you want to use 7 and try it out, by all means go for it. As you can see, a link here for 6.1 builds. 6.144 was released a couple days ago. We've already got installed in this system here, but download, install, accept the defaults, reboot out of principle, although it's not necessarily required, and then you're going to want to launch it. Now, first thing we want to do, if you've been following it with these videos recently, understand that all the systems we built up to this point are standalone. They're isolated from each other. So if I were to build home PC in this example, or these other sandboxes you see me having on the system, they cannot communicate with each other. Now, obviously, if we're going to build a virtual lab, we want them to communicate, domain controllers, network systems, client systems, things like that. So first thing we want to do is go into File and Preferences, go to Network, and we're going to add a NAT network. So what this means is all the systems, when they're configured for that NAT network, will share an IP address space, and they share a connection out. But the point is they will be able to communicate with each other. So if you want to look at the properties, you can just double click and you'll see it's in the range of 10.02.0/24. It does support DHCP by default, which may or may not be useful, but at the very least, just to get a system built and working, that's perfectly fine. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. So I'm going to go ahead and build my first system here. I'm going to build a domain controller using Windows 2019. So to build a system, I click New. I'm going to give it a name. I like using very consistent names. I'm going to call it LabDC. Go ahead and choose the operating system version. I'm going to click Next. Now, domain controllers typically like at least 8 gigabytes of memory. Depending on the capacity of your system, I'd recommend going at least 12 gigabytes. 16 could be useful, but in this case, just to get started, I'm going to go ahead and do 12 gigabytes, so 12288. That's binarily. That's a weird thing that I do. An even number, so 1024 bytes in a kilobyte. So that's, if you do the math out, 12 times 1024 is 12288. So I'm going to click Next. I'm going to accept the default hard drive size of 50 gigabytes. Virtual is fine. I don't need to mess with this too much. Dynamically allocate just means it's going to grow as necessary. I'm accepting the defaults. It's storing it under my user profile under VirtualBox VMs. That'll come in. That'll be important a bit later. Click Create. And there we go. It is built. I'm going to go ahead and start. And now the first thing it's going to ask for, it should ask for, is point it to a CD image of, in this case, what I want to use is Windows 2019. So there we go. It's prompting me for it. And now I've already have one in there, but because I've used it recently. But if you didn't, click the Browse Folder button, click Add, browse to your ISO file. Now you may have one place you can get it. I'm going to leave it up to you in Microsoft, but you can download an evaluation copy of Windows 2019. If you're a student just trying to get started, those will run by default, or typically 180 days, half a year before they require activation. Side note, if you ever were to play with one of these and you want to activate it, there are some scripts you can find online to convert evaluation to open license. You apply your key and you're good to go. So I've already chosen mine, but I'll go ahead and do it here anyway. Click Open. So I can see here my Windows 2019 Core build. I'm going to choose that and click Start. I'm going to maximize my screen just to keep it a little cleaner here and clean up my old windows. So it's booted from the ISO file, and I'm going to walk you through the entire process of installing Windows Server 2019 and basic settings that are useful for a lab environment. Now in this mode, as it gets started here, it does not have the virtual tools installed, which allow you the system to transfer keyboard and mouse input back and forth between your host system, in this case my laptop, and the guest operating system, in this case Windows Server 2019, seamlessly. So until those tools get installed, it's going to be a little weird behavior-wise. The mouse doesn't transfer cleanly. So what I like to do is just stay focused, keep all the mouse and keyboard input in that system initially, and I'll tend to use the keyboard for going through the initial setup. So Windows 2019, I'm going to hit Alt-N for next, I for install. I'm going to go ahead and choose Windows Server Standard with the desktop experience turned on. Notably, it gives you the disk cleanup utility. Alt-N for next. Alt-A for accept, N for next. I can't actually do an upgrade. If you were to choose this path, it would actually complain about an upgrade not being possible because the hard drive is blank. So Alt-C for custom. Default hard drive is fine, N for next. And we're off. Now, one thing, because those virtual tools are not installed, if I were to start doing other things here, move my mouse keyboard focus out, check some emails, the system by default will deprioritize the running VM. So it would actually run slower than if you just keep the processes for VirtualBox running in the foreground. So a little tip to keep it installed as quickly as possible. Once you get installed and can install the virtual tools, then the prioritization, the scheduling between your host and guest becomes a lot cleaner. So we'll just hang out here for a bit and get this installed. All right, that's the first reboot going now. And second reboot. All right, so pick a password. Just choose something you're gonna remember to use and do it consistently. So finish. Okay, so it's booted up, and to get the Control-Alt-Delete, you can use the menu function to send Control-Delete, but in my case, I've assigned the control. If you see at the bottom right control is my assigned key, so I can do Control-Delete. And it gives me the effective equivalent of Control-Alt-Delete. Login. And the first thing I'm going to want to do is install the virtual tools to improve the performance balancing between the host and guest, as well as just make the keyboard, mouse, and all the input controls a little smoother. If you choose to do it down the line, it's these virtual tools that allow you to do copy and pasting between your host system and the guest systems. So go into Devices, insert Guest Edition CD, and it's going to mount an ISO file in the virtual CD drive, which will show up in a moment. And we just have to install that. Okay, so I mounted the Virtual Editions CD. So just open up the File Explorer. You'll see me use the Recycle Bin a lot. That's the fastest Explorer window I can bring up. The Recycle Bin icon is almost always on desktops, which is why you see me go to Recycle Bin. I know it confuses some people to say, why'd you go to the Recycle Bin to open up a file? It's because it's a shortcut. So Virtual Editions, I'm going to go ahead and double click on VBox Windows Editions. And that mini applet will actually choose between 64-bit or 32 if as necessary. There we go. Now this process seems a little slow on my system right now. It's actually because of my screen recording. It actually runs a lot quicker if you're not screen recording the process. So next finish, or next install. I'm just going to ignore that right now. We don't care. Once the profile will take over when we install the domain controller roles and services. All right, go ahead and reboot manually later, and I'm going to do one other thing, which I forgot to do actually setting this up. Domain controllers are application servers, they are databases, so what I want to go ahead and do is also give it more than one processor by default. That'll make things a little faster. I'm going to go ahead and shut down. Should have done that at the beginning, but that's okay. So I'm just waiting for it to shut down. Then I'm going to go ahead and go into settings and give it another processor. All right, so back in VirtualBox, I'm going to modify the settings of my lab DC. system, processor, bump it up to 2, click start. So now we have 2 processors, the virtual editions, client editions as well. Going to run quite a bit faster. Okay, let's go ahead and log in. I'm first going to set my display resolution, make it a little bit more user-friendly. Before I do much else, I'm going to go ahead and rename the computer since I want it to be LabDC. Oh, if you want to get rid of the virtual box editions, you can also just eject it once it's there. So let's do that. So properties on this PC to change the name. Oops, there we go. Lab-DC and reboot. Okay, quite a bit faster with the processor and virtual editions. So let's log in, set a couple system settings, and set up domain controller services. Okay, once in Server Manager, a couple things I want to do first. Local server, I want to go ahead and set my time zone. Oops, time zone. There, that's better. Now, go ahead and install, we're going to add a role to the server, add roles and features. Next, I'm doing local config, yeah. And the roles I want to add are twofold. One is domain services, and the other is DNS. Now, most people tend, intricacies of Active Directory, but Active Directory does require DNS in order to function. That's how find all the domain services and all that networks through DNS service records. Since Windows 2000, that's just been a native part. Most people tend to use native Active Directory domain name services, DNS services built in, because it's easy, it works, but you don't actually have to. But in practice, I don't know, I haven't come across any organizations in a while that do. Here we go, server roles, Active Directory domain services. Go ahead and add features that it needs to add for us and select. And we're also going to add DNS server. Same thing, go ahead and allow it to add recommended features. Yes, continue. We don't have any records yet. Actually, cancel that. Before I do any of that, we need to set our IP address. So by default, it will use DHCP, which we don't want. If we want to just prove things are generally working, we should be able to, there we go, ping google.com, for example. And we can see that internet access does actually work at the moment. So let's go ahead and configure our static IP address for our domain controller. Now, the range, as we saw earlier, is 10.0.0.2/24. So we're going to allow internet access, going to stick to that range, but we're going to assign everything ourselves. And for that, my convention is 10.0.2. Oops. 101 for domain controller. 2.2. The gateway doesn't change. Now I'm going to go ahead and put it's elf for the domain 12.0.0.1 because when we install domain services, it will default to looking at its own DNS server. So that's just the easiest way to get that going. And to prove, I cannot ping another domain name such as Yahoo, but I can ping static IP. If I type it correctly. So internet activity still works, but there's no name resolution at the moment. That's exactly as expected. So let's install our services. Do this again. Role base, yes. We're doing a local server selection. Server roles, Active Directory domain services. Add what it needs. DNS server. Add what it needs. Next. Next. Accept the defaults. Next. Next. You can choose that box to restart automatically if necessary. Normally at this point it doesn't need a restart. It's just installing the necessary files. And then once the files are installed, we'll need to run, if you're familiar with the old Windows 2000, 2003 days, the DC promo utility. That'll get prompted for us in the Server Manager UI. You can, if you want, bring up Task Manager just to help monitor processor performance. Make sure things are running reasonably well. So 12 gigabytes of memory, we're only using 12%. Often it may default to 16 if I know I'm doing something a little bigger, running multiple applications on the same server. But for the purposes of a basic domain controller, 12 is fine. I do like to give it more than 8 explicitly. I've seen some performance differences as Windows tries to optimize depending on processes based upon how much memory you actually have, or it perceives you have in the system. So this will take a certain amount of time. Okay, so it's finished now. I'm going to close the wizard. And up here in the warning, you can see that we need to promote the server to domain controller. It's got a post deployment. The nice wizard guides us and says, hey, you need to do a few more things before we can turn it into domain controller. Let's go ahead and launch that wizard. And so we're creating a new force and domain. I still do like to use local. It ensures that the traffic's kept local and won't get routed out on the internet if there's some accidental misconfiguration or something like that. So lab.local, pretty straightforward. That's the root of our domain name. The NetBIOS domain will be lab. Except the defaults, Windows 2019 does set a Server 2016 default domain enforce functional level, which is fine. Our directory services restore mode password, again, just for lab environments, using the same is an acceptable cheat. Next, confirm the NetBIOS domain name. A few more confirmations. Let it do its thing. Yes. Just warning us all these things are going to happen. And it's warning us that when you click install, it will reboot automatically at the end of install, which makes sense. So there we go. It's going to run. We'll come back after a certain amount of time when it's complete. Okay, you're about to sound out. Yes. So that default administrator account of administrator will become the default domain enterprise schema admin. And we'll do a couple tweaks as soon as we log in with that for future management, following well-accepted practices. I'm not going to use the term best practices, but generally acceptable and useful practices. Okay, here we go. Okay, so let's just check our network connectivity. Ping something like google.com, that responds, so that's good. All right, so even though this is just a live environment, definitely want to go ahead and create another admin account, a daily driver admin account, as I like to call it. Not one that's the default enterprise and schema admins as well. Best practice also is you should never really keep that for your main admin account, and it be kept separately and audited and closely monitored. So let's go find our accounts. I'm going to go ahead and create a new account. I'm going to call it system admin with the username of admin. Keep it simple. Okay, I've created the user, system admin. We're going to make it part of the domain admins. And unless I explicitly need enterprise or schema changes, I'm going to run all my activities within the admin account. Okay, so I'm logged in as the admin. Let's go and set some basic options inside of the domain. So one thing about group policies, since Active Directory is the foundation for all management of Active Directory Windows and networks, one thing a lot of people don't realize is when you look at AD users and computers, anytime you have a folder icon with that little extra bit there, that's an actual OU, organizational unit, which can have policies applied to it. The native generic folders cannot. So what I like to do for system computer objects is create organizational units, or OUs, specifically for domain servers and domain workstations, just as a start. You don't have to do it this way, but I find it useful to get in the habit of organizing Active Directory, keeping it as well organized as possible. So we've done that. So when we add new computers to the domain, we'll need to manually move them out of computers and put them into their appropriate domain servers or member servers and workstations for client systems. So the other thing we want to do is we want to go ahead and use group policy to disable the native Windows firewall. We will get into using the Windows firewall, which is a perfectly good tool, but initially it's just easier for the purpose of getting things going, especially in a lab experimental environment, not having that affect what we're doing. So conventions here, what I like to do generally speaking is create a separate policy. There's a balance between too many GPOs and readability, but I'm going to go ahead and create a GPO here. I'm going to put the date and my initials in. It's always a really handy way to document who's doing what, and I'm going to call it disable Windows firewall. Now down the line, I could modify this and call into domain level security settings. When we get into hardening, that's something that's going to be worthwhile doing. That way you can go to 10U to find all related settings and changes and tweaks for a particular role, in an example of domain hardening or domain security settings. So at this point, we're just going to call it disable firewall. I'm going to go ahead and edit it. If memory serves me right, it's in here. Windows settings. Security settings. Windows Defender firewall. Okay. The main thing I want to do in a domain profile is initially just disable it. By doing just a domain policy, that means if a workstation happens to end up on another profile, the firewall will turn on and have some measure of protection. Useful in case you accidentally put the system in the wrong mode or it ends up in the wrong network. You don't want to expose all the services to the potential internet in that scenario. So I'm just click OK. Windows Defender firewall is off. Okay, so now I can, to prove it's working, I can go ahead and launch command prompt. And before I do that, let's take a look at the local network settings at the moment. We should see that the Defender firewall is running. Domain firewall is on, domain network active. So close that, minimize, GP update, group policy update, /force. Check the firewall now. We should see that it's off. Firewall is off. Okay, so that is trick. So there we go. That is a Windows 2019 to 2016 mode domain controller. It's now ready to use in a live environment. So I'm going to end this video here. We'll do another one with a Windows 10 client, and we'll join that and go from there. They will be able to. I've forgotten where it is. That's great. Okay, I have to refresh my memory on what that was. Well, I didn't pause in time. It's easy. It works. We don't actually have to. But one fact I don't know. I put virtualization a while to do. Build ourselves a home. No, not a home. Office virtualization software. Specifically, no. Version is virtual. Is version. We're gonna make it for domain admins.